I want to welcome you to this particular class. My name is Dr. Beda Olabu, and I have a series of lectures on human anatomy. In this particular lecture, I want to just give you an introduction to what human anatomy is. I prefer giving this lecture in two parts. The first part, I want to talk about the definitions and scope of human anatomy, which we are going to do in this particular session. And in the second part, which is still part of introductory series, I prefer handling definition of some terminologies which we use in human anatomy. So in this first part of the introduction, as I've told you, we will focus on definitions and scope of human anatomy. We are going to look at the various divisions of human anatomy and what each of those divisions entail. So the intended learning outcomes are the following. Perhaps it will be important that we define what is human anatomy, what is physiology, and what is pathology. In as much as we are not going to talk about physiology and pathology in this particular lecture, but it is important that we define all those and we see how they are related to anatomy. After those definitions, we are going to look at the three divisions of human anatomy. That means that anatomy has three divisions. And for each of the divisions, we are going to state the scope. In this lecture also, I'm going to take you through an overview of the body regions and perhaps the subparts of each region. Also, we are going to see how the body is organized in a particular hierarchy from simple to complex structures. And lastly, we are also going to look at the different organ systems in the body and state the key functions in each of the systems. So let's revert to our first agenda, which is to define anatomy, physiology, and pathology. We'll start by defining anatomy. Anatomy is basically a branch of science that deals with the study of the structure of the body. It could be the whole body or it could be just some part of the body. The point I want you to take at this juncture is that when you talk about anatomy, we are talking about the study of the structure. The word to underline the structure. And so, when you talk about human anatomy, it means we are not just studying the structure of anything, but the structure of the human body. When we are focusing onto the human body, then that's why we are calling it human anatomy. This is particularly important for any student training in any field that is concerned with healthcare. Now, closely related to anatomy is physiology. What is physiology? Physiology is the branch of science that is concerned with studying functional processes that take place within a living organism. Remember, anatomy focuses on the structure, but physiology now focuses on the functional processes. In particular, physiology looks at the physical, chemical, and biological processes that take place within a living organism and also look at how these processes are controlled within this living organism. The process must be controlled, you understand, they must be regulated so that we don't have extremes of function. The process must function within a particular limits that are allowed. So we see how that is regulated. physiology looks at that particular concept. Then the third thing we agreed that we are going to define is pathology. Literally speaking, the term pathology refers to the study of suffering. You know, logos means study and pathos means suffering. That's too literal. In a better way, pathology is the study of disordered body function, study of alterations within the body. Maybe a more comprehensive thing would be to say that pathology focuses on the structural, remember anatomy, and functional, remember physiology, but now changes. There are alterations. It focuses on structural and functional alterations which take place either at the level of the cell, the tissues, or organs, and how these ones are related to development of disease. Because these changes are the ones which then explain the disease processes. So pathology focuses on study of disease processes in simple terms. Having defined those three, we can now look at our second major objective, which is to talk about the three divisions of anatomy. While we're here, we're also going to look at the scope of each division. So there are three divisions of anatomy. The first one is gross anatomy. The second one is microscopic anatomy. And the third one is developmental anatomy. There could be other terminologies which are used to refer to the other two. For example, microscopic anatomy is commonly called histology, and developmental anatomy is commonly called embryology. Let's focus on these three divisions of anatomy one by one and try to understand what each of them entail. I'll start with gross anatomy. So, having agreed on what anatomy is, we know it's the study of structure. What exactly is gross anatomy? Gross anatomy is the study of the structure or any of its parts as visualized with your naked eye. And I'm using the term naked eye in quotes to refer to the fact that we are not magnifying beyond normal human vision. If you have spectacles, for example, the way I do, we are not really, my spectacles are not really magnifying beyond what normal human visual can appreciate. So even if I'm using spectacles to study the parts of the body, that is still gross anatomy. And as I said, I could be studying the whole person as an individual, but I could also be studying different organs within this individual. For example, I take the heart and just look at the surface of the heart, either inside or outside. Maybe it's the lung or the brain. As long as I'm appreciating the structure using my naked eye, we consider that gross anatomy. In terms of implementation, there are two main approaches that are used in the study of gross anatomy. This is what we call the topographic approach. A topographic approach to the study of gross anatomy, or generally to the study of anatomy, is where we are studying the body structure according to the different regions of the body. And in a short while, I'll be taking you through. So what are these different body regions? At this point in time, I want you to understand that topographic approach is where we are studying the body according to its regions. Maybe it's the head, neck, thorax, abdomen, whatever it is, leg, foot. We are focusing on a particular region. And so we call that topographic anatomy. Then we have the systemic approach. Systemic approach is where we are studying anatomy of the body according to the different organ systems which the body has. And again, in a short while, as we agreed in our objectives, we are going to see what are these organ systems in the body. So if you do that, then we are saying that that is systemic anatomy. Let me say at this point that topographic anatomy is a bit very detailed, so to speak, compared to systemic anatomy. It's easy to teach anatomy from a systemic approach and you finish very quickly. Topographic approach, on the other hand, requires a lot of skills, a lot of patience, a lot of details. And so depending on whatever unit you're doing, whatever course you're doing, there could be different curriculum for different people, depending on the depth of anatomy that your training requires you. Some syllabuses will go with the systemic approach, and some courses will go with topographic approach. For example, if you are training doctors who are going to be surgeons, then you'll expect them to be having a topographic approach as a key element in the training, because they need to know what is next to what when they're cutting. Now, for the sake of just having a clue of almost everything, I prefer to do what I call a hybrid approach. A hybrid approach is where you incorporate both topographic as well as systemic approach. This hybrid approach may not be used all the time. It could just be used in some situations where appropriate. For example, if you are teaching on musculoskeletal system, for example, that's a systemic approach. Then you feel like perhaps I need to tell this particular group of students more about the anatomy of the leg. Just an overview. You see, when you talk of anatomy of the leg, that's a topographic approach. Now, in hybrid approach, you then bring in topographic aspects of anatomy in as much as your primary template is systemic approach. So for example, you teach through a systemic approach and you're done with a particular system. Let's say you're done with respiratory system, or that time that you're studying the respiratory system. Then that could be the best time to then give the student an overview of the anatomy of the thorax. So just saying a hybrid approach is where you bring in topographical aspects, but primarily you've been using a systemic approach. Again, that will depend on what course you are doing as a student. Maybe there are some aspects of topographic anatomy that is required of you in some parts. Okay, now having explained to you what is topographic anatomy and what is systemic anatomy, and agreed that topographic anatomy focuses on the study of the body according to the different regions, perhaps then it is important that we understand at this point what are these body regions. They are different parts of the body. I prefer grouping the different body regions under 4 large categories. The first one being the head and neck region. So I believe anybody who is in this class is aware of what is head and what is neck. Basically, that is the head and this is the neck. So when you talk of head and neck region, we are talking about the head as well as the neck there. That's what you call neck, that's what you call head. I prefer considering that a big body region, the head and neck region. Then we have what we call the trunk or the torso. Torso is T-O-R-S-O. The trunk is this region from where I'm pointing right now up to there. So the whole of this is the trunk. Within the trunk we have the thorax, which is this one from there to somewhere there. We have the abdomen, which is this one here. We have the pelvis, which is where the different reproductive organs are found, most of them. And we have the back, and I believe all of you know where the back is. So those are the sub-regions within the trunk. The third big body region is what we call the upper limb. This is the upper limb from there all the way to somewhere there. So please note, don't call this whole thing the hand. We call it the upper limb. And the upper limb also has about 4 or 5 subparts. There are some parts of the upper limb that are attached, and there are some parts of the upper limb which are free. The attached parts of the upper limb are these ones. So this region of the upper limb, this region of the upper limb that's attached to the anterior, the front part of the chest is what we call the pectoral region. Then this region of the upper limb that also extends slightly to the back there, that's what we call the shoulder region. So the pectoral region and the shoulder region are basically the attached parts of the upper limb. Then we have the free parts of the upper limb. I believe you are aware there's a joint there, which we call the shoulder joint, and a joint here, which we call the elbow joint. So this segment from the shoulder joint to the elbow joint, that one, is what we call the arm. The arm is also called the brachium. I also believe that you are aware that the joint here is called the wrist. This segment between the elbow joint and the wrist joint, this one, is what we call the forearm. You can call it antebrachium. And then lastly, from the wrist down, this is what we call the hand. So now today you know what the hand is. Don't call the whole of this the hand, only this is called the hand. This is the forearm, that's the arm. Again, don't call this one the upper arm, it is the arm. If you want to talk about upper arm and lower arm, then it's about dividing the arm into upper and lower region. But the whole segment is called the arm. Maybe I mentioned something about the hand. If you look at your hand, it has 2 surfaces. There's this surface here, which is that one. That surface is what we call the palm of the hand. And then this is called the dorsum of the hand. Right, those are the parts of the upper limb. The last big body region is the lower limb. Just like the upper limb, the lower limb also has some subparts or the segments. Let's start with this one here, which we call the gluteal region. It may go with many other names depending on the society you come from. But in this scientific class, let's just call it the gluteal region or the buttocks. So that is a segment. Then we know that we have a hip joint there. And down here we have a knee joint. This segment between the hip and the knee is what we call the thigh. I believe that one everyone knows. And then you know that we have a joint here called the ankle joint. So this segment between the knee and the ankle joint, that's what we call the leg. Again, I want you to understand that the whole of this is not called the leg. Only this segment between the knee and the ankle is called the leg. The whole of that is the lower limb. Lastly, the part below the ankle joint is called the foot. And just like we did for the hand, the foot also has two surfaces. The surface of the foot that faces the ground is called the sole of the foot. So that's the sole of the foot. You can call it plantar aspect of the foot. And then this is the dorsum of the foot, just like dorsum of the hand. So don't confuse. The term dorsum is used for both foot and hand, fine. But when you look at the front side of the hand, we call that the palm. And the one for the foot is the plantar. So we talk of palm of the hand and plantar of the foot, and not the other way around. Great, so I've taken you through the major regions. So once again, if you are studying anatomy from a topographic approach, then you study anatomy according to the regions that I've just given you, although sometimes you can still go into finer details. For example, the hand still has some specific structures, like there's a thumb, there's index finger, there is a ring finger, there's a middle finger. You can still opt to study even those individual details. That is still topographic anatomy, region by region. Now, I want us to talk about the hierarchical organization of the body. Perhaps I need to mention that the human body, and indeed living organisms, are organized in particular hierarchy. This hierarchy sees to it that the body is built up from simple structures to more complex structures. And from your chemistry, you must have remembered that there are some tiny things that constitute some structures of matter. Perhaps it will be good to start at the level of the atom. Although I know you are aware again that the atom is still made up of some simpler things like, protons, electrons, and neutrons. But let's not go there. Atoms make up matter. And in our definition from high school, an atom is the smallest unit of an element that participates in chemical reactions. Let me give you 2-3 seconds to think about some examples of atoms. Okay, if you do remember your periodic table, that shouldn't be a big deal. When atoms combine, they form molecules. Again, in your definition of molecules from high school, you may have said that molecules are the smallest unit of an element or compound that exists on its own. Examples of molecules would be, CO2, that is a carbon dioxide molecule, O2, that is the oxygen molecule, H2O, that's the water molecule, and such examples. So a molecule will be a combination of different atoms. It's a group of atoms that can exist on its own. When molecules combine, remember our objective here is to build the body. And think about your body in this case. So with that in mind, then we are going to do this. After molecules combine with the purpose of building up the whole body, they form what we call macromolecules. The term macro here just means big. So macromolecules are large molecules that build up the body. Which are these large molecules that build up the body? I'll give you 4 of them. The body is built up of proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids. So proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids are examples of macromolecules that build up the body. When you talk of nucleic acids, we are referring to the DNA and the RNA. What happens when these macromolecules combine? When these macromolecules combine, they constitute the organelles. What are examples of organelles? I'm giving you another 5 seconds to just toggle your mind around that. Examples of organelles. Alright, so I believe you have in mind mitochondria. I wonder why almost every student must think through that, like almost be the first example that comes in your mind. But fair enough. Mitochondria, ribosomes, Golgi apparatus, endoplasmic reticulum, peroxisomes. You know them. Those are organelles. When organelles combine, they now form the cell. And perhaps from high school you define the cell as the smallest unit of life. Maybe let's say that we don't have a very nice definition of what the cell is. And that definition of the smallest unit of life is perhaps the best we can take. Although there are also some challenges with regard to that definition. You know, by saying that the cell is the smallest unit of life, in simple terms, we are saying that in this hierarchy that we're describing, what we call life begins at the level of the cell, onwards. If that holds water, then it makes us question some things. If you say that life begins at this level, onwards, does it mean then that the mitochondria that we've just mentioned are dead? You know, that's a bit hard to decipher. Again, if we say that life begins at the level of the cell, so these things about viruses, you know, they're tiny, they're nucleic acids. Are they alive or they're dead? Well, those are debates for you. So that concept of the cell is the smallest unit of life is a theory. It's one of the cell theories. Multiple cells would combine. We have many cells in the body, many cells in the body. But these cells can combine. Similar cells combine to form tissues. Similar cells combine to form tissues. Let me put it this way. We have billions and billions of cells in the body. If you are to classify the cells in the body according to their types, perhaps you'll get over 100 different types of cells in the body. You know, red blood cells, white blood cells, nerve cell, and even those white blood cells. There are different types of white blood cells, neutrophils, mast cells. So that's what I'm saying. We have different types of cells in the body. According to varieties, there are over 100 different types of cells in the body. But when these cells combine to form tissues, we have still a good number of tissues, maybe over 20 different types of tissues in the body. And you can give examples of tissues in the body. Again, let me give you some 5-second mind break to just think through examples of tissues in the body. So perhaps you have in mind epithelial tissues, bone tissue, cartilage tissue, adipose tissue, and the like. When tissues combine, they form organs. And think through different organs in the body. In this image, we can see stomach. Now think through the organs in the body. Stomach is an organ. Kidney, lung, heart, liver, uterus, all those are organs. When organs combine, they form organ systems. And I'll be giving you a chance to just think through different organ systems in the body. When organ systems combine, they form the organism. And so you and I are examples of this organism, but we are made up of different organ systems. Each organ system is made up of different organs. An organ is made up of multiple tissues. A tissue is made up of many cells. A cell has several organelles. An organelle is made up of macromolecules. Each macromolecule has several molecules within it, and each molecule has atoms. We've seen that the body is organized in a particular hierarchy from simple to a complex structure. Having said so, I want us to now talk about the different organ systems which are in the body in an attempt to explain to you what we do when we study gross anatomy from a systemic approach. So this is your question. Perhaps take a minute, okay, maybe a few seconds to just list the major organ systems in the body. And if you are able to state one key function or the key functions of each organ system in the body, that would be good. So let me give you a minute to just toggle through that. Okay, I believe 1 minute is over now. I'm hoping you've listed as many as possible. I'm hoping your list has at least 10 organ systems. I want to take you through an overview of the key organ systems of the body. Let's start with the one you're seeing in front of you now. And this is what we call the skeletal system. So what do you know about the skeletal system? The skeletal system is basically the system made up of different bones. And we know that skeletal system is important for movement. That's what you call locomotion. It also protects you, like it protects internal organs. For example, your rib cage protects the heart and the lungs. Your skull protects the brain. Your vertebral column protects the spinal cord. It also provides structural support. You'd imagine that if we didn't have bones, maybe we'll just be a heap of meat. So because we have bones, therefore, things can attach into these bones and offer structural support. And bone is also a very good reserve for the mineral calcium. Over 90% of calcium in the body is stored within bone tissue. Closely related to the skeletal system is another system that is very easy for you to forget, and I won't be surprised if it didn't appear on your list, and that's the articular system. The articular system in particular refers to this system made up of joints. So basically joints fall under the articular system. And the primary role for joints is to allow movements. You know, you move around joints. Different bones move around joints. So we've named two systems so far, closely related to the skeletal and articular systems is the muscular system. The muscular system is closely related to the skeletal and the articular system. When you talk of muscular system, we are referring to this system which is largely made up of the skeletal muscles and perhaps their modes of attachment. We know that muscles are important in movement, so when they contract, they move bones, and their bones move around joints. Apart from that, muscles help us to generate force. If you want to push something, you want to pull something, you want to lift something, you want to jump, use your muscles to generate the force where you're going to use to perform these activities. And think through what happens when it's cold. Your skeletal musculature usually contract in the act of shivering to generate heat for the body. And so we can say that muscular system is important in thermoregulation. Now, we've mentioned three major systems: the skeletal system, the articular system, and the muscular system. These three systems are commonly referred to as the locomotor supersystem. So that when you talk of the locomotor supersystem, we are referring to those three systems combined: skeletal, the muscular, and the articular system. And another common term that perhaps you'll be hearing more often is the musculoskeletal system, based on the fact that we are thinking through the skeletal and the muscular part, but remember, that's also where the articular one also hides, in as much as not being pronounced so much in the term musculoskeletal system. When you talk of musculoskeletal system, we are still referring to the locomotor supersystem. Right. Let's talk about the fourth system. And the system you're seeing is the nervous system. I know in your learning you'll come across central nervous system and peripheral nervous system, but for now let's just call the whole system the nervous system, whether central or peripheral. Nervous system basically coordinate and integrate body functions, and in so doing they regulate body functions to maintain homeostasis. Homeostasis is the maintenance of some activities in the body within some narrow physiological limits. For example, you want to maintain the body temperature within a particular range. You want to maintain the concentration of blood glucose within a particular range. So the nervous system helps to maintain those physiological ranges in the body. Closely related to the nervous system is the endocrine system. The endocrine system is this system concerned with some glands or cells which secrete chemical messengers that are called hormones. So in terms of function, the endocrine system and the nervous system will still perform the role of coordination and integration of functions, and also in terms of maintaining some homeostasis. The endocrine system and the nervous system are commonly called the integration systems for that purpose. The integration systems. Some people may just want to use the term neuroendocrine system, so that when you talk of neuroendocrine system, we are referring to the nervous system as well as the endocrine system. In your list, we've now mentioned 5, if you're counting well. The 6th system I want to talk about is the cardiovascular system. And when we talk of cardiovascular system, we are referring to this system that is made up of the heart and blood vessels. So the heart and blood vessels fall under the cardiovascular system. We know that the role of the cardiovascular system is just to pump blood to the rest of the body. At least the heart does that, and the blood vessels transport the blood. Well, the heart also produces some chemical messengers in terms of hormones, so we can say that still has some endocrine functions. Closely related to the cardiovascular system is actually the blood that flows within the heart and the blood vessels. I prefer calling this the hematologic system. The hematologic system is important for transportation and delivery of substances in the body. It's also important for immunity. It contains cells that help to fight infections. It also helps to maintain homeostasis of some physiological parameters, let's say body temperature, for example, or even the level of acidity and alkalinity in the body. Sometimes you hear the term circulatory system being used, and that term circulatory system may be used to refer to the hematologic system. Sometimes it may be used to refer to the cardiovascular system. Sometimes it may be used to refer to all of them as one big umbrella. And so when you hear that term circulatory system, it will be important that you actually understand what the person talking to you is actually referring to, because all of them are actually right. The term circulation system can be used to refer to both of them or just the hematologic system. Some people use it still for the cardiovascular system. Anyway, Closely related to those two systems is the lymphatic system. When you talk of lymphatic system, we are referring to this system that contain lymphoid organs, basically. So this system is primarily responsible for defending our body against infections, but it's also important in terms of being site for formation of blood tissue. And in the intestines, the lymphatic system is important in terms of absorption of fat. Fat from the intestine does not go into the bloodstream direct, but it enters into the lymphatic system. Then the lymphatic system will eventually transport it into the bloodstream at the appropriate site. I've lost count on the number of systems we're talking about, but most likely we're at around the 8th system, if I'm not wrong. So the 9th one would then be this one. I think when you look at this one, you already know this is the digestive system, and nobody here needs to be reminded the functions of the digestive system. So basically, for the sake of completion, we can still just talk about it, that yes, the digestive system supplies the body with water and nutrients. There's some organs within the digestive system that also produce hormones, like the pancreas produces hormones. So there are endocrine functions as well. Also, there are some organs which excrete some wastes, like the liver. So there are some excretory functions as well. And again, the liver also helps to detoxify some things in the body. So detoxification is still a function of the digestive system. Again, this other system, already know it. I think this should be number 10 now. This is the respiratory system. Primarily, the respiratory system is important for gas exchange, that we take in oxygen and we take out carbon dioxide. So that's the primary role of the respiratory system, but that's not the only function of the respiratory system. As you hear me talk, I'm using my respiratory system to talk to you. The act of production of sound is what we call phonation as a function of the respiratory system. The sense of smell is actually located along the path of the respiratory system. Your nose is part of your respiratory system, and the nose is the one that houses the receptor for smell. So we can say olfaction is also a function of the respiratory system. The respiratory system also helps to balance the acidity and alkalinity of the body. Perhaps you don't know this yet, but there are 3 major things that help in acid-base balance. We have blood, we have the lungs, and we have the kidneys. Also, the respiratory system may have some endocrine functions, and maybe too much to say at this particular point in terms of the endocrine functions of the respiratory system. But as you go along in your anatomy and maybe physiology, you'll come across, so what's the endocrine function of the lungs? I believe we've mentioned 10 of them now, so this should be the 11th system. Urinary system, the one made up of the kidneys, ureters, urinary bladder, and urethra, basically. The urinary system is largely for excretion of waste substances, but apart from that, it also has some endocrine functions. It is important in regulating the osmolarity. We call that osmoregulation. Basically, controlling the amount of electrolytes or minerals as well as water, and that's what we call osmoregulation. controlling the levels of electrolytes, or let me call it minerals, like sodium, potassium, magnesium, as well as the amount of water in the body, so that in a particular osmotic pressure, we call this osmoregulation. In so doing, the kidneys are also able to regulate your blood pressure. And as I mentioned earlier, the kidney is also important in controlling the amount of hydrogen ions in the circulation, or bicarbonate ions in the circulation. That's acid-base balance. The 11th system, let's call them the reproductive systems or the genital systems. Maybe the term reproductive is much better. The reproductive systems, remember, there are two. You can talk of the male reproductive system, and you can also talk about the female reproductive system. But let's look at them as one and just list the key functions of the reproductive systems. So production of the gamete cells is one of the key functions of the reproductive system. You know, the sperm and the oocyte. We call that gametogenesis, production of gametes. Apart from just producing the gametes, the reproductive systems also help in transporting these gametes. The fallopian tube transports the gametes, the vas deferens transport the sperms. The genital system is also important in production of sex hormones. Estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, dihydrotestosterone. These are sex hormones which are produced by the organs of the reproductive system, in particular the gonads, which are referring to the testes in males and ovary in female. Importantly, and this could just be narrowed down to the uterus, that the uterus is the site of prenatal development. The baby develops in the uterus for some 9 months before birth. So it's a site of prenatal development. You may have considered those to be two systems or just one big system. Either way, we know that's there. The last system I want us to talk about is the integument system. The integument system is basically the system referring to skin and its appendages. The skin is important for protection. Apart from protection, the skin is also important in thermoregulation. It helps to protect against infections. It has excretory functions, like through sweat. And it also has sensory functions. We have different receptors which are on the skin. Great. So I've taken you through the different organ systems in the body. We've mentioned about 13 or 14 different systems in the body. And so that was just helping in us trying to rubber stamp the concept of systemic anatomy as an approach to the study of gross anatomy. And so that summarizes the concept of gross anatomy. We've seen that we can have two approaches, the topographic approach, where we study according to regions, and systemic approach, where we study according to the different systems. Now I want us to then look at the second division of anatomy, which is microscopic anatomy. The second and the third division are going to be pretty short, don't worry. So microscopic anatomy is the study of those minute things that your eyes can't see, those tiny things that your eyes cannot appreciate, If you're using just naked eye or spectacles, you can't see, but there's still parts of the body. We can only study them using a microscope. And that's why we call it microscopic anatomy, because we are studying minute things which we cannot see with the naked eye, so we have to use a microscope. You know that we can either have a light microscope or an electron microscope. You should be aware about those two types of microscopes. Microscopic anatomy generally can be divided into two. There's what we call cytology and there's what we call histology. Cytology is the study of cells. And when we study cells, we go into greater details of the cell biology. The best microscope that helps us to study cells is actually the electron microscope. You can still study cells using light microscopy, but the best one that helps to study cells appropriately is the electron microscope. Then histology is the study of tissues. The best microscope that helps to study tissues is the light microscopy, in as much as again you can still use electron microscopy to study tissues. Now, microscopic anatomy is commonly referred to as histology, largely because the aspects of cytology usually aren't that much, but the aspects of histology is quite voluminous and forms a big part of any curriculum that emphasizes on some good detail of anatomy. It's for that reason, therefore, that we sometimes interchange the term microscopic anatomy with histology. And so sometimes when you hear maybe your teacher talking about histology as the unit, just understand that, yeah, the term histology can be interchangeable with microscopic anatomy, even if within that histology you are still going to study cytology. So what's the scope of cytology? In human anatomy, cytology focuses on some 4 key areas. Now, in physiology, there'll be even more and much, much more that physiology will focus on. But in human anatomy, just some 4 key areas of the cell. The first one is cell structure. In cytology and human anatomy, we look at cell structure and we focus on the overall structure of the cell. How does it look like under a microscope? And what are the different organelles within the cell? How do they look like? And because we don't just want to study the structure only, we need to know the role of these organelles. So in as much as we're still talking about anatomy, we're interested in knowing the functions of each of these organelles. So that usually falls under that lecture called cell structure. And I believe you'll have a lecture on the cell structure. Then another one is cell adaptations. This is the background of this is this, that we know that a cell, a human cell, will have 3 major components: a cell membrane, a cytoplasm, and a nucleus. Those are the 3 basic components of a cell. However, we know that different cells perform different functions. There's one cell that will be largely for contraction, it's a muscle cell. There's another cell that is largely involved in releasing some hormones, it's an endocrine cell. There's another cell that is largely focused in absorption of nutrients, from your intestines, maybe another one for transmission of signals in the brain. So in as much as we know that each cell will have three major components, the cell membrane, the cytoplasm, and the nucleus, not all cells will be the same. They will have some structural endowment for them to perform the different functions that they do perform. I would not expect a cell that transports substances in my intestines to be similar to a cell that transmits signals in my brain, in as much as all of them will have a cell membrane, a cytoplasm, and a nucleus. So with that background, in this chapter on cell adaptations, we try to look at the structural adaptations that different cells have to enable them perform those different functions. Then the third one, we talk about the cellular genetics, the genetics of the cell. And anatomy is not the best unit to talk about genetics, to be honest, because there's a lot about genetics that anatomy doesn't go into. Perhaps the only reason why anatomy talks about genetics is so that it can bring you to the level of understanding that there could be some things called mutations and there could be some things called chromosomes. Because now in this unit of anatomy, there'll be some abnormalities of chromosomes that we see that give us some structural abnormalities, and we want to talk about them so much. Perhaps that's why we bring cellular genetics and anatomy. Otherwise, anatomy is not the best place to study cell genetics. Don't study cell genetics and anatomy, then you think that you know so much about genetics. Lastly, we study the cell cycle and cell division. Cell cycle is basically the events and stages that the cell undergoes from the time a cell is formed until that cell divides into two daughter cells. So that's what we call cell cycle, the phases and stages and events that a cell undergoes from the time a cell is formed up to the time that the cell divides into two daughter cells. And cell division is when a cell divides into two daughter cells, basically. So we look at that as well. We look at the phases of the cell cycle. We look at the process of mitosis. We look at the process of meiosis. You are most likely familiar already with mitosis and meiosis, and perhaps not so familiar with cell cycle if you are being introduced to human anatomy for the first time. Fair enough. So this is the scope of cytology. How about the scope of histology? We generally divide histology into two. We have what you call basic histology and systemic histology. When you talk of basic histology, we focus on the histological organization of the four basic tissues. Now, I need to highlight this. I told you that we have over 100 different cell types in the body, if you have to just list them. But that these cell types, when they combine, they form tissues. And I told you we have over 20 different types of tissues in the body. However, if you group these tissues, even though there are over 20 different types of tissues, these over 20 different types of tissues can be grouped into four major categories. And those four major categories are the ones we are calling the four basic tissues. The four basic tissues are these ones. We have epithelial tissues. We have connective tissues. We have propulsion tissues. And we have nervous tissues. These are the four basic tissues. So you most likely have a lecture on epithelial tissues, a separate lecture on connective tissues, maybe multiple of them, separate lecture on propulsion tissue, and nervous tissue, again, maybe multiple of them for that one. when you look at the organization of the 4 basic tissues, we call that basic histology. Then there's what we call systemic histology. Systemic histology is when you look at the microscopic organization of the various organs in the body, but not randomly. You look at them according to their organ systems. For example, you can say today we are going to look at the microscopic organization of the organs of the digestive system. So you look at microscopic organization or microscopic structure of the esophagus, stomach, liver, rectum, pancreas. So that becomes what we call systemic histology. You're looking at the histologic organization of each organ system in the body, of different organs according to their organ systems. Depending on the mode that your course requires in terms of delivering anatomy, that may have different facets. It may be incorporated as part of your systemic gross anatomy, then highlighted within, or it could be just a separate lecture on its own for each system. It depends on the level of detail that's required of your course. Right. The third division of anatomy that I want to finish with is developmental anatomy. When you talk of developmental anatomy, what are we referring to? Developmental anatomy is the study of prenatal developmental processes. We are studying the things which happen before birth. So in terms of delivery, we usually start from the time that the gametes are formed, the time that the sperm is formed, the time that the oocyte is formed. Remember, the male gamete is called the sperm, the female gamete is called the oocyte or the ovum. So from the time the gametes are formed, the term we used earlier for that is gametogenesis. We start from gametogenesis. And when do we stop? When that baby is born. Assuming that the whole thing is a success. When we do this, we don't just look at the normal process. We also focus on the abnormal developmental processes. So developmental anatomy does not just look at the normal. It also highlights the abnormal processes. Those abnormal processes that may have happened during embryonic period and therefore may have implications on the child or on the pregnancy. So you focus on them. And so this is the division of anatomy that will help us to understand the basis of congenital malformations. Congenital malformations are birth defects. This is a division of anatomy that helps us to understand birth defect. For example, if a child is born and they don't have a brain, how do we explain that? If a child is born and they don't have one of the limbs, how do we explain that? So this is the division of anatomy that helps us to understand the basis of those birth defects. Assume a baby has been born and you look and you wonder, are they male or are they female? You can't tell. Or this baby has been born and they only have one eye in their forehead instead of two that we expect. How do we explain this? This is a division of anatomy that tries to explain the basis of malformations. In terms of delivery, we talk about some events that take place before conception. And remember, this would be the gametogenesis. Gametogenesis is the process of development of the gametes. So when you form the sperm, you call it spermatogenesis. And when you form the oocyte, we call it oogenesis. Gametogenesis takes place within the gonads. The male gonad is called the testes, and the female gonad is called the ovary. So spermatogenesis takes place in the testes. Oogenesis takes place in the ovary. When that has happened, the next step that we talk about is fertilization. This is the process of fusion of the sperm and the oocyte. The fusion takes place within the fallopian tube. So in this division of anatomy, we look at gametogenesis. We also look at the process of fertilization. Once fertilization has happened, then we know that the woman has conceived, or at least conception has taken place. You know, these days the conception doesn't have to happen within the woman, as intervention can still happen in a test tube as part of interventions, and you'll be taught more about that depending on the course you're doing. But assuming a natural process, fertilization will take place within the fallopian tube. Once conception has taken place, we are now ready for development. After conception, I prefer dividing the period into 3 for the sake of understanding some key events that take place. The first period is what I call the pre-embryonic period, or the early developmental period. You can call it early developmental period or the pre-embryonic period. And this in particular refers to the first 2 weeks after conception. The first 2 weeks after conception. This is what we're calling the pre-embryonic period. During these first 2 weeks, some key things happen. One of them is basically that the conceptors, whatever has been formed, will move from the site of fertilization to the site of implantation. Implantation is the attachment. Apart from that, during this period, we'll also have implantation itself. And when the conceptors implants, usually inside the uterus, when it implants on the wall of the uterus, then we say now pregnancy has been established. So the woman is now pregnant. Before that implantation, we can't talk of pregnancy. In particular, implantation largely takes place during the 2nd week after fertilization. The period from the 3rd to the 8th week after fertilization is known as the embryonic period of development. The embryonic period of development is an important period of development because this is the period when the body organs actually form. So we call it the period of organogenesis, the period when body organs of the baby form, the period of organogenesis. It becomes the most sensitive period in embryology because this is the time the different organs and organ systems are established. Almost all of them. It is therefore the most sensitive period in prenatal development. And I'm saying that to mean that if there's some maybe not so good chemicals that interfere with the development at this period, then there are higher chances of the baby developing some congenital malformations. So this is the period that the conceptus is most at risk of development of congenital malformations. After the 8th week from the time of conception, we talk of the fetal period of development. So the fetal period of development is a period from the 9th week until when the baby is born. That's a fetal period of development. The fetal period of development is largely a period of maturation of body organs. The body organs mature. But it is also largely the period of ossification. Ossification is basically formation of bones. The bones don't particularly form during this period, but they form largely in this period, most of them. Now, in terms of bulk, this embryonic period of development has a lot, because it's the one that explains to us more about the development of each organ system in the body. So, over 90% of books of developmental anatomy are dedicated largely on the embryonic period of development according to the different organ systems. And so embryology can also be taught to you in a different way depending on the course you're doing. We may divide embryology into two. We may have developmental anatomy into two. That we have what we call the basic, and there's what we call the systemic, or the general and the systemic. In general embryology, that's when you'll be taught more about gametogenesis and fertilization. You'll be taught about what happens in the first 2 weeks of development. You may be taught about the things that happen in the 3rd and the 4th week of development in general, and you can be given an overview of what happens in the fetal period of development. But now in the systemic embryology, it focuses largely on the embryonic period of development for each and every system in the body, largely talking about how do the body organs form according to their organ systems. It forms the bulk of developmental anatomy. It is for that reason, therefore, that developmental anatomy is also termed embryology, and I hope you notice that even me, I use the term embryology even before telling you why I use the term embryology, because it's largely subconscious. So developmental anatomy is commonly referred to as embryology for that reason, and so you can use the term interchangeably again. You can call it embryology or developmental anatomy. The common term is actually embryology, but I just wanted to use a more scientific, correct term before I can explain to you why it can also be called embryology. Subsequently, you can just call it embryology. Maybe I say something again about this dating thing. The dates I've given you here, if you were keen, you noted that I was talking about after conception. So we call that the embryonic dating. The embryonic dating is based on the number of days or period after conception, so that perhaps conception is considered day 1. But that's not the kind of dating that you'll be hearing often in clinical practice or in basically in the marketplace. You'll not be hearing that much. The one that you'll be hearing more are based on the menstrual period of a woman. Now let me clarify this. That in the menstrual cycle of a woman, most women, their menstrual cycle lasts Each cycle lasts 28 days, most women. In such a case, such a woman most likely ovulates around the 14th day of the menstrual cycle. So if your cycle length is 28 days, then you most likely as a woman ovulate on your 14th day. And remember, these days are not necessarily calendar days, they are physiological days. We consider day 1 of the menstrual cycle as the first day that the woman or a woman sees the menstrual flow. So if the day that she sees the menstrual flow is considered the first day, 14 days later, that's around the time that we expect her to ovulate, if her cycle length is 28 days. Around the time of ovulation is the time around which conception will also take place. That means what? That there is a period of 2 weeks between the day that the woman starts to see her menstrual flow and the day that she actually conceives. There is a period of about 2 weeks difference. But we don't use the conception days for practical purposes. It would be very difficult for a woman to tell you, I conceived on this day, and especially if she has sex almost every day. It's not possible, unless there's some particular intentions about it, which may not be practical all the time. So for practical purposes, in as much as in developmental anatomy, we use the embryonic dating, and we'll be clarifying that one days after conception. For practical purposes in the marketplace, you'll be using what we call the gestational dates. Gestational dates are basically based on the days based on the menstrual flow of a woman. And so they usually have a difference of 2 weeks. So when I say this woman is 5 weeks pregnant, according to the gestational dates, in actual sense, that embryo is 3 weeks old, according to the embryonic dating. I want you to be able to understand that, because it may give you a lot of confusion when you interpret some things in the clinical practice and some things in embryology textbooks. Having said so, you'll hear of the pregnancy, a full-term pregnancy reaching 40 weeks. So those 40 weeks are based on the gestational dating, where the first day is the day that the woman saw the last normal menstrual flow, the first day of the last normal menstrual flow. If you count from there, then give it 40 weeks. But if you are to count the embryonic age, then we'll go with 38 weeks. Right, I think I have overemphasized on that one. And so, maybe just to joggle your mind a bit, in terms of what we've done in this lecture, we have defined what is human anatomy. I believe you can do it. I believe you can also name the main regions and subregions in the body. I believe you can name now 13 or 14 organ systems and state at least one key role for each. I believe you can also describe the levels of organization of the human body from simple, you can start from atom, up to complex, the organism. You're able to name the 4 key basic tissues, and you can outline for us the prenatal developmental periods as I've done to you. And so that will be the end for that lecture. Thank you very much. That will be the end of the first part of the introductory lecture, which was focusing on definitions and scope of human anatomy. So you can watch out for the second part of the lecture that will focus on anatomical terms. And the aim of this is basically to help us familiarize with the anatomical language. Thank you very much. We'll stop there.